stories for you guys. All the stories in this video are from Reddit. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, and I hope you enjoy tonight's scary stories. Now, with that being said, and without further ado, let's get into tonight's stories, shall we? So, the first story of this evening is quite a long one, but it is so interesting. This story was originally posted by a user called HBiscuit26. Their story is called The Haunting of Lilac Cottage, England, my childhood home. Before I start this story, I'd just like to let you all know that I'm predominantly a skeptic, or at least I was until this house. I actually rarely talk about the events that happened in there because I don't have any rational explanation for them. But that house has stuck with me well into adulthood. Back in 2009, me, my mum, and my stepdad moved into a really old, rustic, rural cottage in England. My father had passed away not too long before, and this was going to be a new start for all of us. The house was an absolute bargain. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 very spacious living rooms, and a huge annex at the back that was essentially a second house. We couldn't work out why it was so cheap. We went for the viewing, and the family eventually told us that their elderly mother had passed away there peacefully in the annex, and they just needed to get away from the feeling of her. Now that should have probably been a first red flag. Now, at the time, we weren't put off by this, and we bought the house. From the off, it was unsettling, were the stairs. Now, that first night was freakishly cold. I pulled my blankets up to my head, but after my dad passed away, I had suffered with insomnia for years, so that and the cold made for a zero sleep combination. So I ended up laying awake for hours, just sort of staring around the room. My bedroom door was one of those old, mismatched wooden country house doors. It didn't quite reach the carpets, and after a few hours I could hear the creaking of floorboards directly outside my door. When I looked over, I saw shadows that seemed even darker than the darkness of the hallway walking past my door. I presumed one of my parents had gotten up to use the bathroom at first, but this went on, back and forth, back and forth, for several minutes, and it was fast. It was like a brisk walk. And not to mention, next to my door was the locked door to the annex. Anybody walking at that speed would have hit the door, but nothing. It freaked me out, and it had me dreading the next night. Now, this kept happening every night for a few weeks, and I remember vividly one night I actually left my bedroom door open. Now, around the same time I heard the creaking, I turned around and, unmistakably, there was a figure, blacker than black, walking forward and backwards in front of the door, just about visible in the darkness of the hallway. I couldn't take my eyes off of it the entire time it was there. It's safe to say I never slept with the door open again. But this is where things started to get properly creepy. I had been terrified of this shadow for weeks now. There was a really horrible feeling that I had around it, like it was after me. And one night, as I was going downstairs for dinner, I had the same cold feeling that I had been having in my bedroom at night. And for just a second, I froze in place in the dark hallway and looked to my right to the annex door. And there, sure as anything, and without my sleepy eyes to blame on it, I saw the same black shadow walking directly at me at high speed. I ran downstairs as quickly as I could, and I told my parents everything. They mostly laughed it off, and they didn't believe me, and they tried to reassure me that ghosts aren't real, and there was no chance of anything about this old lady still being in the house. Now, a bit of backstory. This old lady was terrified of the previous owner's family dog, so much so that they had installed a pulley system in the house so she could pull a cord from her bedroom downstairs into the kitchen to see what was going on. Now, as soon as we entered the kitchen, it stopped. We ventured up into the annex to see what could have caused this, but nothing. No sign of anyone. And my God, I hated it in there. It was even colder and more lifeless than the main part of the house, and I just felt like I needed to leave as soon as I possibly could. My parents didn't quite believe that this was a ghost just yet, but they were clearly less skeptical than before. From here on out, any activity became much more obvious. We, my parents included, started to hear knocking from the annex door next to my bedroom. Noises from downstairs that sounded like something was moving down there. Sometimes my fish tank light would flick on and off with an audible click, and it would wake me up, and I would often even wake up to my wardrobe doors being wide open with no breeze whatsoever. Now, one night I was sat reading alone in my room, and one of these wardrobe doors opened by itself, very wide and with relative force. I got up cautiously, closed it, and ran downstairs to see my parents. When I came up, around 15 minutes later, every single cupboard door, around a dozen of them, were open as wide as they would go. Now, lots more went on too. Taps turning themselves on became a particularly regular occurrence, and one night I awoke to the sound of my cupboard door opening again, and I saw droplets of water running from the bathroom next to the annex all the way to a few feet from my bed. I was terrified. It was around 6 months after all of this had started that we eventually moved out. My grandma had begun to grow unwell, and she couldn't care for herself anymore, and she moved in with us. From the beginning, she hated that house. My grandma was so incredibly sweet and calm, and I've never seen her distressed like she was when she was there. And on one night in particular, when I was sat downstairs in the kitchen with her, she took my hand, pointed directly towards the annex, and said, "Don't you go in there. I don't like it in there." It's safe to say that she scared the crap out of me. On the last night we all spent together in that house, I was awoken by selling it so desperately that he lost almost a quarter of the price he had paid for it, and he's never told us why. I've promised myself that one day I'll reach out to the current owners of that house and see if they have also experienced anything, but I haven't just yet. That was such a wild and interesting story. When I was reading it, I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. It feels like this is the premise of a film or something. It is absolutely insane, the amount of activity that they experienced in that house. You know, the house being quite cheap for what it is. That's something you always see in films as well, you know. Houses that are haunted and they can't get rid of them, so they have to lower the price of them and just hope that somebody is skeptical enough to buy one. Either way, I am very glad that the presence of that old lady in that house wasn't more aggressive. You know, I'm glad nobody got hurt. I'm not saying it is pleasant, you know. They basically got tormented on a daily basis. I am also very curious to know what the experiences of the current owners of Lilac Cottage are. Whether the old lady is still there. I wonder what she wants. Now, the following two stories that I've got for you are from the same Reddit user called Guerobladecruz. Now, they also have a YouTube channel that is mostly gaming, which I will also link in the description box in case you want to check that out. Now, the first story is called I Got a Strange One. My dad was born and raised in Mexico. He lived with my grandmother and his siblings. He told me that one day my uncle was walking home late one night and he started hearing some strange noises. He didn't think much of it at first, and he just kept walking. The further he walked, the more he could hear the strange noise. When he was coming up on a small bridge to get home, he heard the noise even louder and clearer this time. He could hear that it was a woman. She was sobbing and saying, "Mis hijos, mis hijos." And as many of you have guessed where this is headed, you're about half right. My uncle walked towards the woman and asked, "Señora, ¿estás bien? Miss, are you okay?" But there was no reply. He walked closer to where he could touch her shoulder, and she saw that it looked like she wasn't fully there. She was slightly transparent. happens to him. My uncle described to my dad that she had the face of a horse and she lunged at him. He took off running and was huffing and puffing when he got home. My dad says that my grandmother was mad at him for staying out so late and didn't believe him when he tried telling her what happened. According to my dad, my uncle was absolutely terrified. The next day, my uncle told my grandmother what happened, and this time she believed him and told him she thought that he may have seen La Llorona and was lucky she didn't drown him in the water. I love local folklore and myths. La Llorona is one of my favorite, folklore legends. And if you don't know what it's about, it is a woman who comes out at night. She has lost her children and they were drowned. So she comes out and she weeps and cries for her children, and she finds anyone who crosses her path and tries to drown them in the river as well, like her children. What is interesting to me is that she had the face of a horse. That is different from any other La Llorona accounts that I have ever read before. I can't blame the uncle for being terrified in this situation. You kind of would be if you were walking around and there was a half-transparent woman with a horse face who comes for you. That is quite terrifying. Very, very interesting legend. Alright, the next story, which is the last one for this evening, also by Guerobladecruz, is called Oh Boy, Have I Got Another One for You All. Now, this one is another experience of his uncle, which this uncle, he had a lot happen to him when he was younger. So, one night, an uncle of mine was walking home. The sun was just starting to set, and in Lagos at the time weren't many street lights. So when it got dark out, it got real dark out. My uncle had been told by my abuela, my dad's mum, many times to not stay out too late and to be home before the sun goes down. My uncle was a very stubborn person when he was younger, according to my dad, and always blew off everything my abuela would say. On this night, he definitely should have listened to her, and if I'm not mistaken, he did after the events I'm about to retell. I'm just quickly gonna come in here to say that you should always listen to your mum and always listen to your abuela because, they've lived a lot longer. They've had a lot of experiences, so you should listen to them. As he walked, he saw a man standing on a street corner corner. The man looked to my uncle and said, "You should get home, kid. It's getting late." My uncle, being the jackass that he was, said, "Screw you, old man. Don't tell me what to do." And he went about his leisurely walk home. After a couple of blocks, my uncle saw the same man standing on a different street corner. The man said the same thing that he had said before. My uncle didn't think much of it and told him to go F himself and continued walking. After a few blocks, my uncle saw the same man, but this time he had a big, snarling dog with him. The old man once again said the same thing, but this time with the dog growling and baring its teeth. Now my uncle was a little more bothered by this at this time, and understandably so, but still told the man to shove it, and he kept walking. He was nearly home at this point. The sun was gone, the moon was bright in the sky, and then he sees this man again. This time he's just laughing maniacally. Not only is he laughing, but he has 2 dogs now. According to my dad, my uncle said the dogs and the man's eyes were bright red, and as soon as my uncle walked past them, he heard the man let the dogs go. My uncle took off running as fast as he possibly could. The dogs were barking, snarling, and giving chase. As soon as my uncle reached my abuela's house, he started pounding on the door, furiously begging her to open up. Now once the door was opened, he flew inside and told her to shut it fast. My abuela was trying to figure out what was happening, and my uncle told her about the man and the dogs. My abuela said he was being ridiculous and said there's nothing out there. She opened the door and saw nothing, but my uncle swore that he could see the dogs pacing outside, back and forth, back and forth, teeth sharp, eyes red, fur black, and waiting for him. This uncle man, the things that he sees, it's insane. This was such a thrilling story to read. I got goosebumps reading it the first time. You know what always really creeps me out is whenever, the creepy person in the story starts laughing maniacally, or when they just smile really wide and it's like a really unnatural smile. That always really creeps me out. I'm glad the uncle could run faster than the evil dogs, because who knows what would have happened if they had caught up with him. I do wonder who that guy was and why he was there, and if he was even human at all. sadly, that was it.